So welcome everyone to, I guess, our fifth session on René Girard's Violence in the Sacred. This is focused right now on chapter 6 as a kind of review chapter, which the title of that chapter is From Mimetic Desire to the Monstrous Double. So I just want to start us off with a kind of review. And for those of you that haven't been with us in the prior sections that we analyzed, we place these videos on the YouTube page so you can take a look at those. But we also, I have the sense, and I don't know if others agree, that it's actually okay to enter into this text, like from chapter 6, for example. Maybe not ideal, but you certainly get a sense of you're not lost. Like it works out, right? There's especially chapter 6, in part because he's not focusing as much on a primary example, right? Like a tragic play, like he was with the whole Dionysian thing. So it kind of works. It's just a sort of conceptual chapter. Anyways, part of what we want to do today is look at the intersection of Girard and psychoanalysis. And obviously, Girard has little to say on Lacan, but obviously a lot to say on Freud. Part of the reason that Lacan is not mentioned in this text is in part because, and well, let me just say, Girard does speak of and offer a critique, albeit a fairly small critique of Lacan's work in interviews in Things Hidden since the Founding of the World. So you can see some of those in that text. But what I want to do is just review chapter 6, go through the Oedipus, his critique of the Oedipus complex in Freud, and his critique of Totem and Taboo. And I think by the end, we will really have a clear sense of some key points of profound difference in Girard's whole theory of desire, right? Which before somewhat eluded us. I think now, when we really put him into dialogue with Freud, we start to see various divergences. And then as an interlude, I have a little analysis of the Fort Da game. So I want to read when Fort Da comes up in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So we'll excerpt that so we know about this game and what it's about. And then I want to look at Lacan's reading of it and then Girard's reading of it, because that, I think, will further help us sort of create the clarity of the contrast in Girard's theory of desire from the sort of primary psychoanalytic theory, right? So that's my agenda. Yeah, great. And let's see, has Kayam joined us by chance? Okay, no worries. I've messaged him, so he should be with us soon. Okay, so from mimetic desire to monstrous double, the first thing we have to note here is that, the issue is before you have the surrogate victim, right? You have what Girard will call the rival. And importantly, the rival is kind of what we might call a sort of indifferent figure. By indifferent, it's not necessary to privilege like the father, for example, in the place of the rival. So part of that has to do with the fact that for Girard, desire is not necessarily linked to pleasure or enjoyment or to sexuality. Very interesting thing, which we'll examine as we move along here. I mean, it can be, but its structure exceeds just being caught within a necessary relationship to pleasure and into sexuality. So in this passage I have here, he says it is the rival who should be accorded the dominant role. We must take care, however, to identify the rival correctly and not to say with Freud that he is the father, or in the case of the tragedies, that he is the brother. So it's not a necessary thing. Our first task is to define the rival's position within the system to which he belongs in relation to both subject and object. And then I highlighted this: the rival desires the same object as the subject, and to assert the primacy of the rival can lead to only one conclusion, and that conclusion is violence, right? So there's a kind of necessary emergence of violence once the rival is thrown into the subject-object relation, okay? So here we have desire and violence. And what he wants to say in his analysis of Euripides and in his analysis of Sophocles and of Greek tragedy writ large is that the rival is a kind of phantom, right? And in some sense, the rival is a little bit different than what he names the monstrous double, and we'll get to that in a moment. But we can just read this quote here. I think it's very important to flag. He says, every tragic protagonist is fated to pursue this phantom. And as soon as one individual attempts to incarnate divine violence, rivalries spring up. The violence remains reciprocal. There is no profit to anyone when only blows are traded. The chorus perceives the train of events and scrupulously avoids involving itself in the tragic action. So this goes back to a theme we've seen before, which is the story of tragedy is a story of the collapse of a social harmony, of a collapse of what Girard will call an order of distinction, right? So a tragic cosmos, like in Oedipus, the background of Oedipus is actually a plague, right? So there is a kind of what we last time referred to as a kind of fundamental chaotic social scenario. And in that chaotic social order, family turns against family, and the kind of situated role of the social order is completely thrown out of whack, right? And this is why I use the sort of Aristotelian term of stasis. So stasis referring to a form of conflict which the causality of what's harboring, you know, the instability has been completely lost. And so in that sense, that's the sort of precondition of tragedy for Girard. And then he says, nothing perhaps could be more banal than the role of violence in awakening desire. Our modern terms for this phenomenon are sadism or masochism, depending on its manifestations. And we regard desire as a pathological deviation, because for Girard, desire and violence are kind of inextricable, okay? So we believe that the normal form of desire is nonviolent, right? This is the kind of modern myth, which is why later you'll see with his critique of Freud's theory of desire, he's actually wanting to make a claim that it is only able to be founded on this kind of pseudo-mythical ground of death drive, which is a problem for Girard, because there's something about modernity which lends itself to a sort of paranoia or a fear around the imposition of the law or the status of the law in society, right? So we'll get to that in a moment. So in other words, psychoanalysis tries to corral desire or to sort of make desire adhere to the norm or to something normative. And I think that Girard is actually very much against this proposal, and furthermore states that the only institution truly capable of doing that is a religious effort, a religious institution. That religions possess the best technology for how to treat desire. So back to this issue of rivalry, I think this is really important because initially I was under the impression, I don't know about you, that, you know, acquisitive mimesis, right? There's a notion of acquisition of the rivalry or competition, right, of the rivalrous exchange, was about a desire to possess like a certain object, right, and the kind of contestation of master-slave maybe over that. But here he says something different. He says rivalry does not arise because of the fortuitous convergence of two desires on a single object. Rather, the subject desires the object because the rival desires it. So that's a super important point we talked about last time. In desiring an object, the rival alerts the subject to the desirability of the object. So the rival is a kind of, he often refers to the rival also as a figure, right? So if you say father figure, it's not that you are looking at a rivalrous relationship to a father from the standpoint of the way the father desires, but it's not necessarily like a specific thing. Like that's actually part of the critique of Totem and Taboo, which is like, as you know, the myth of the primal horde was actually a myth around the acquisition of specific objects, in this case, the sexual possession of women, right? And that was the crime, the great crime of the father, and the great injustice of the father, which was to foreclose the son's participation or sharing in women, right? But here he's saying something slightly different. He says the rival then serves as a model for the subject. So model, not only in regard to such secondary matters as style and opinions, but also and more essentially in regards to desires. So that's important that we kind of keep this notion of that in mind, because it's what allows Girard to sort of theorize away from Freud's specific triangularization theory of desire in Oedipus. And then this is also really interesting. And again, in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, you get a lot more treatment of Girard's take on Freud. But here's one interesting point. He says, Freud's famous death wish is no more than a last surrender to mythological thinking, a final manifestation of that ancient belief that human violence can be attributed to some outside influence, to gods, to fate, to some force men can hardly be expected to control. Once again, it is a mode of thought that refuses to confront human conflicts squarely. It is an act of evasion. And here he's talking about psychoanalysis, right? It's an attempt to pass the buck and find an alternate sacrificial solution in such a situation, which makes the solution increasingly difficult. So, wow. I mean, we would have to go back to the introduction of the death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle to really get a sense of whether or not it's true that Freud, in fact, makes this quote unquote outside influence to the death drive. Because in a certain sense, what Girard is saying about death drive, his understanding of it is that Freud is really meaning a kind of biological determinism whereby the repetition compulsion draws the organism back into a state of inorganic relaxation, right? Which is true. But then he furthermore adds another twist to it, which is a kind of reading, I think a vulgar reading of the death drive, as if all the drives have a kind of inevitable, like dark movement towards pure death or something like that, which is not exactly, I think, what Freud is really saying, because although he's against the monistic conception of the drives that Jung is giving. Remember, the life drive, which he doesn't call eros exactly, but the life drive is a dualism that Freud is insisting on. So it's not exactly true. I mean, we know that for Lacan, he'll say that all drives adhere to the logic of the death drive. We know that Lacan will say that. But actually, I don't think it's true that Freud will say that, okay? Why do I say that? Because what Freud is talking about in terms of the elasticity of the drives actually refers to something about the immortal status of the biological cellular level. So I would actually propose the opposite reading of what Girard is saying here. What's mythical about Freud's theory of death drive is actually what his understanding, and you can call it a cursory understanding of biological thought of his time, maybe. But what he's really saying is that man possesses a kind of infinite elasticity to circumvent death drive, right? Which is in part why psychoanalysis becomes such a technology of the war effort, both in the ending of First World War, but really in World War II. In what sense? Precisely in the sense that the psychoanalysts were the advisors to the military on how to create a war machine that could mitigate traumatic war neuroses, right? This is Lacan's famous thing with Wilfred Bion, where he gives a speech to the British military sort of psychiatric community and basically says, the psychoanalysts won the war for Britain because they created the conditions for a military unit to succeed without developing a fetishization of a kind of master general. Like, in other words, they created a horizontal form of identification and distribution of leadership. But in so doing, the group fortified itself also from the onset of trauma in some sense. So they became kind of immortal, you see. So I actually think that it's much more complex, and it's not nearly as plainly nihilistic when we talk about death drive in Freud. And I would also point out, we talked about this in previous groups, to Catherine Malabou's incredible article on plasticity, where she looks at plasticity versus elasticity, right? Because the elastic part of the drives for Freud are sort of the immortal side of the cell. Like, he makes a claim that at the cellular level, we possess a kind of infinity. This is actually very interesting, apropos Alain Badiou's whole theory of the subject as well, because the inhuman is not that we're zombies. That's not the inhuman aspect of death drive. No, the inhuman aspect is there's a kind of infinite resolve. So it's much more on the side of a kind of resolve over internal, external relations, right? Because for Freud, the whole issue with the war neuroses in the First World War was having to do with this notion of the condition of being in a state of fright, and something happens. You're not nearly as fortified as you would be if you're in a state of anxiety. Because in a state of anxiety, you have a kind of anticipation for the bomb or for the bullet. So you're there, your composition, your body is more fortified for it. Therefore, the possibility of that being a traumatic event is lessened. And that's also why the possibility of trauma for somebody who actually received the wound at the corporeal level, at the bodily level, was much less than for the one who witnessed it, right? You know that famous distinction he makes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It's not a profound mystery, actually. I think Freud gives us an answer as to why this is the case. So anyways, that's a little diversion there. So then we move on to chapter 7. And now we're getting into this sort of the thick of things. And just as an aside, if anyone is interested in really reading a thorough Girardian critique of Freud, I would recommend this book called The Freudian Subject by Mikhail Borch Jakobsen, who's a, I think it was done maybe in the 90s. Incredible, incredible book. What he does is take Girard's work that he's done in Violence in the Sacred and Elsewhere and really elaborates a Girardian critique of psychoanalysis. He also wrote a book called The Black Book of Psychoanalysis, which is a scathing critique, one of the most scathing critiques of psychoanalysis maybe ever written. And anyways, what you'll see here by Borch Jakobsen is a really, really nice argument, which suggests that in fact, Freud's whole theory must be best understood as a break from the mesmerism and the hypnotic community. So like, this is why there's this incredible book by Lacan called The Crowd. And it's a study of that Freud read prior to his group psychology work. And the argument of Lacan is that basically we can understand insurrections or revolutions or the masses and, you know, the plebeians and so on from the standpoint of them being mesmerized or hypnotized by the Führer or Trump or, you know, some authority figure, right? And that Freud was deeply moved by this argument, but never adequately created a theory of identification with the group that adequately got out of this notion. So Borch Jakobsen, in essence, will accuse psychoanalysis in its group psychology stage of not adequately producing a theory that would be beyond, because, you know, in group psychology, Freud is still actually talking about how the social bond is still about the necessary love of the father, right? So it's only through kind of this social link as produced through love of the father that you can mitigate the totalitarian potential, that you can mitigate, like, you know, a kind of scenario like Hitler or Mussolini, et cetera, right? So that's something to look at. It's very, there's a lot more to it, but that's just a taste of it. And again, just interject at any time with comments or questions or anything like that. So point number 2, Freud rejects the order of the mimetic relation to the father and posits a non-causal identification with the father. And this notion here of non-causal identification with the father is what I was referring to just a moment ago, where Freud sort of wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to say in both Totem and Taboo and in Oedipus, his theory of Oedipus complex, that there is something deeply primary, deeply almost linked to the law as such, like law of desire, that tethers the father in this super necessary structural relation, right? And therefore, it's actually non-causal, right? It's sort of, and this is also why Girard has this whole thing, like the notion of from outside, right? And the mythical father, right? So that's why when we look back here at the rival is a model. So in some sense, one of the things we should do the next time we meet is actually closely read Girard's review of Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, because they're both kind of doing something similar in terms of trying to displace this uber structural account of Oedipus like Freud is, right? And here, I mean, Girard and Deleuze and Guattari are kind of doing similar things in a weird way, although different, but very similar, which is why in some sense he's very congratulatory of their work, actually. And I posted this in the Slack, the review. Okay, so here we go. this is what I consider his primary critique of Freud. And I think we should read this entire passage. So on 187, and I'm working on the PDF that I shared with everyone. So he says, I'll just read this. And here we arrive at my principal complaint against Freud. The mythical element of Freudianism has nothing to do, despite traditional assertions to the contrary, with the unconscious nature of those basic impulses that determine the individual's psychological makeup. If my complaint were a reiteration of that well-worn theme, it would undoubtedly be classified among the reactionary criticism of Freudianism. But in the final analysis, what I actually object to most in Freud's obstinate attachment is to a philosophy of consciousness. It's fascinating, okay? The mythical aspect of Freudianism is founded on the conscious knowledge of patricidal and incestuous desire. That's important. Only a brief flash of consciousness, to be sure, a bright wedge of light between the darkness of the first identifications and the unconscious, but consciousness all the same. Freud's stubborn attachment to this consciousness compels him to abandon both logic and credibility. He first assumes this consciousness and then gets rid of it in a kind of safe deposit box called the unconscious. In effect, he is saying, ego can suppress all consciousness of a patricidal and incestuous desire, only if at one time ego truly experienced it. Ergo sum. So you see the point there. If the residue of the trauma of a collective nature, of the murder of the primal father, you know the basic premise here, right? It's that the sons band together and perform an act of patricide in order to create a new social order that would be founded on, it's kind of like, if you like, Freud's elementary theory of the birth of something resembling like a social order founded on justice in a distributed sense. You can also think about this from the standpoint of jouissance. Lacan will say so as well, which is in order, it's not even master discourse. This is something much more perverse than this, right? An order in which enjoyment is completely blocked to all other, and the father has this monopolization, right, on the sexual possession of all women and so on. That's the kind of mythical thing, right? And of course that is incestual as well, right? And as you know, as an aside, I don't know if you're aware of this, but it's a very similar point that he makes to the birth of the Jewish really civilization in Moses and monotheism. Are you guys aware of this one? What he basically says is that the murder of Moses by the Jewish people created the possibility for the Jewish community to possess a unique connection to reason. Because there was a dialectic that was produced at the origin of that murder, which allowed for a guilt to emerge that superimposed over the community, a guilt over the killing of the primal father. And actually the other point there is that Moses was an outsider, actually. That's the whole other thing, that the founding father was actually not of the community, right? Which is a very interesting thing that you can look at in comparison to Islam as well. And that's a whole really, really fascinating thing we could talk about more. But nonetheless, it's very similar here because it necessitates a certain sublimation of that guilt that hangs over the social order. So the social order is founded on that guilt of the murder, but that guilt also creates the conditions for, let's say, elementary forms of justice, democracy, and fairness, right? So the guilt sort of keeps those things in check as sort of values or higher possible values, right? However, psychically, you have this dynamic also occurring, okay? So there is a kind of residue of the incestual murder. And then Girard has all of this thing that he talks about, which I think is a beautiful point. He says, you know, in the motif of detective novels, the whole genre of detective crime novels and stories, part of the whole point, and this is very much true if you look at like detective movies and stories and so on, is that the criminal cannot help but unconsciously leave a trace of himself on each murder that occurs, right? There's all, and often it is the case in a detective story that is conscious, right? That there's something about the guilt which hangs, right? There must be a residue of it that's left over, right? And so all I'm trying to draw your attention to is that this, for Freud in Moses and Monotheism, was the reason why the Jewish people became particularly adept at art and science and so on, right? It's because they couldn't face the traumatic truth that founded their community, which is the foundation in the murder of the father. So it's similar to Totem and Taboo with some differences that we can elaborate later on. So just trying to draw your attention to this critique here. And we'll get to the notion of consciousness in a moment. In fact, let me pull up another, let me stop this and pull up another. Hey, Cade, welcome. Okay. Here we go. All right, so I want to walk through this sort of Word doc because it's just a little bit easier, more flexible. Can you all see that? Okay, is that zoomed in enough? It's good? Yeah. Okay, nice. All right, so here we are. I've just highlighted, these are my notes, I've just highlighted things that I think is useful for us to discuss and really key passages and so on. So he's giving us both a very specific critique of the anthropological inadequacies of Freud's Totem and Taboo. There was this guy, Robertson Stevens, who Freud really leaned on as his go-to, I think, anthropologist or whatever. And Girard basically says that Freud did a lot of misreading of him and so on and so forth. But keep in mind here, Girard by no means falls into this academic discourse where he discards Freud because he had a bad method, right? That's not what he's saying. Actually, what Girard is saying is that Freud had a bad method anthropologically, but he discovered certain things that no one had ever discovered before. And one of them, actually, was the centrality of the surrogate victim. But he didn't follow the logic of the surrogate victim far enough, like as far as Girard thinks that he should have. So we'll see that develop here. But let's just go through this. He says, this is, I think, important on the superego. Freud's definition of superego presupposes something quite different from a mythical consciousness of rivalry. He seems to have based it on the model's identification with the obstacle, an identification unperceived by the disciple. The superego is, in fact, nothing more than a resumption of identification with the father, now appearing chronologically after the Oedipus complex rather than before it. So that's interesting, especially on this notion of obstacle. He wonders what he has done wrong and struggles to find separate areas of application for the two commands. He finds it difficult to see where he is at fault. Certainly he has broken no law yet known to him. So he applies himself to discovering some new law that will allow him to conduct his conduct as illegal. So this is a mimetic process. The mimetic process detaches desire from any predetermined object, whereas the Oedipus complex fixes desire on the maternal object. So that's super important, right? The mimetic concept eliminates all conscious knowledge of patricide incest and even all desire for it as such. The Freudian proposition, by contrast, is based entirely on a consciousness of this desire. So this is why I want to make a pivot to the Fort Da game. Because in the Fort Da game that Freud's grandson plays with his daughter, okay? The child must, in some sense, possess a consciousness of the abandonment of the object being the mother, I think is what Girard is saying. And what he's further saying is that that's actually nonsensical, or rather not necessary, that the child have this necessary correspondence to the maternal or to the mother. So that's important. Let's read a little bit more. The duality of Freud's position stems from his effort to separate two poles of thinking on desire, cathetic and Oedipal at one extreme, and mimetic at the other. But any attempt to sever the link between the two will end in failure, as did the attempts at synthesis that preceded it. It is hopeless to attempt to isolate the three elements of mimetic desire: identification, choice of object, and rivalry. When the superego proclaims, "You may not be like this, your father. Some things are his prerogative," Freud is clearly referring to the mother. That is why he adds this double aspect of the ego ideal derives from the fact that the ego ideal has the task of repressing the Oedipus complex. Indeed, it is to that revolutionary event that it owes its existence. Okay, so are we clear on these two forms? There's the cathetic Oedipal, which is this consciousness. It's wrong because it's based on consciousness of the maternal, right? As a kind of, almost like a transcendental object, right? And then there's the notion of the mimetic desire. And what is that? That's based on the kind of notion of the model of the rival, right? So interesting, right? Then Girard has something very interesting. Sorry, jump in.
Yeah, I have something here that I'm wanting to perhaps add to this without hopefully making it any more confusing. But I want to kind of maybe back Freud here a little bit compared to Girard, because I think what's happening is because these two are taking on their descriptions from opposite places, that they're kind of sort of saying some of the same kinds of things in a totally different way. And I think this is especially important when it comes to identification. And there's a passage at the top of, maybe it's about, I think on your PDF, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, the last of the 5th paragraph above where you had the quote, "And here we arrive at my principal complaint."
Yeah.
And it's talking about identification. And he's talking about, he says, for Freud, his identification with his father then takes on a hostile coloring. He's talking about the son with the father, and becomes identical with the wish to replace his father in regard to his mother as well. And I think what he's doing is he's overinterpreting Freud here to be sort of literal. And I'm not sure Freud is saying that, because Freud is coming from a different place. And the place that Freud, to me, is coming from is a place where he's saying that the subject is decentered. The subject has a problem with his subconscious. And that creates all these Oedipal problems, along with the law, the superego, all these things. Sort of becoming conscious and having an ego is ultimately sort of not everything that happens. And I think what Girard is trying to say, at least my interpretation, is that there's an exactness here that's happening, that if only Freud would have sort of gone a little further, he would have hit on this idea of what Girard is sort of espousing. But I think what Girard is doing here, if we look at this, is sort of misinterpreting Freud. He's saying that there's this exacting aspect, this objective method here of sort of pulling out these relationships. And if only we use mimetic desire to sort of be that objective difference, that's really what's happening. And I think when he does that, he's not giving Freud enough credit for Freud sort of coming from the idea of a person and sort of building the case for what makes a person tick, which I think is where Freud really is trying to maneuver things. So I'm not so sure like when he talks about, for example, here in your quote of becoming conscious,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's required. I'm not sure there's a consciousness and a repression that's required. It could be something in the social, as Lacan would say, or it could be this rivalry, even, as Girard would say. I don't think it necessarily follows this exact path, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when he says this double aspect, that we have the cathetic Oedipal at one extreme, and then we have mimetic. What he means by mimetic is this more elemental basis of the operation of desire as such. That like there's no outside of desire. There's no mythical substrate from which desire imposes itself on the psyche, on the one hand. On the other hand, you know, the whole notion of cathexis, right? And the tethering, let's call it, to the maternal. Mm-hmm. You know, Girard doesn't seem to claim that this is central at all, and that it actually muddies the water, right? It actually creates more confusion about what's actually at stake, and that the mimetic is not only more primary, but maybe is all that we need in some sense to theorize desire itself, right? Because that's how I read what he's saying, basically. But let's continue on because there's still a lot more to tease out here, unless anybody else wants to jump in. Feel free to just jump in if you have questions or thoughts.
I guess it's something I'm a bit unclear on. So like here, his argument against Freud is around the fact that like the child becomes sort of conscious of this thing, but then like his objection is to the entire like idea of the conscious and the unconscious, because like on 194. Then he goes on to say, like, it does away with the unconscious. So I'm wondering if that's the case, where would, like, desire be situated, if that makes sense?
Right. Yeah, I think he's offering a critique of both, which is that the whole premise of this notion of superego is sort of Freud's invention of a law that presupposes that the subject have some kind of pre-conscious orientation to it through cathexis and through Oedipus complex and all of that. And of course, he's saying that this is kind of founded on a falsely mythical ground. And part of this also is really important to understand what he means by ambivalence. We look at on page 192, 193. Because here's the key point. Freud is giving us a theory of desire, which is based on a certain, what Lacan would later call Cartesian theory of the subject, right? Which is a subject split by psyche and body, right? Or speech and body, right? More speech and body for Lacan, right? But I made this point here. Girard is against this fundamental ambivalence of thinking desire as fundamentally caught up within this kind of corporeal level, right? Which is part of the reason why, when I was saying before about Freud's theory of death drive, he's leaning on so much biological theory to present the theory of the death drive. And Girard basically wants to say, we don't need all of that to theorize desire. Desire itself is this, triangle that presents the problematic already. So Freud is just muddying the water by relying on this certain version. So let's see what he has to say about this notion of ambivalence. So he says, the term testifies to the existence of the mimetic pattern in Freud's mind and to his inability to express correctly the relationship among the three elements of the structure, the model, the disciple, and the object, that is disputed by both because the model's desire has made the object desirable to the disciple. The object represents a desire shared by both, and such sharing leads not to harmony, but to bitter conflict. That's Girard's model, right? That he's just outlined. Now he says, Freud does not realize that desire itself is at the core of the identification. And that is why the affects associated with it mutate from imitation, admiration, and veneration to despair, guilt, and resentment. So Freud does not realize that desire is already at the core of the identification. He cannot openly acknowledge the model in the identification to be a model of the desire itself, and thus, so to label these effects as ambivalent is to confine them to a solipsistic context, a traditional philosophic subject, instead of identifying them as a fundamental trait of all human relations, to the universal double bind of imitated desires. So Deleuze and Guattari will call Freud's theory of Oedipus a classic double bind, as Batson develops it. And Girard will also call the theory of mimetic desire a double bind, right? So in both instances, it's not like the theory of mimetic desire is something which Girard is trying to reinforce or make normative. No, he's actually, that's why like Peter Thiel starts these initiatives to consult businesses on how to get rid of it, right? So that's important as well. And then, yeah, on 193, it's this notion of the psychic bodily contradiction that Freud is working with. And I think, to Ben's point, you know, that actually gives Freud a certain richness that Girard is negating or saying we don't need, right? And he says, today, everyone imagines himself turned into the physical, able to decode the body's messages after Freud. Yet in all of Freud's work, there is not a single example of ambivalence that does not have its origin in the obstacle model. That's an interesting point. So we see why he says that. Because desire's operation is creating the emergence of superego. You don't need all of this extra stuff of cathexis, of death drive, and so on, right? This biological level of cellular. You don't need all of that. Due to Freud's embrace of ambivalence, thanks to this idea and a number of others, psychoanalysis has been able to grant a reprieve and apparently to grant new life to the myth of the individual by reasserting the individual's claims of physicality. Yet this is the very myth it should be trying to demolish. So you know what he's doing here? He's leaning on a certain anti-humanism, Girard is, right? Against Freud. Girard's sort of bringing a kind of anti-philosophy against Freud, right? And I pose this question here, which is, does that mean the theory of mimetic desire is not reliant on consciousness? And I think the answer is clearly yes, it's not. So everybody with us so far, this is very complex. I think we're trying to pick it apart piece by piece here.
I was wondering a little bit when you're talking about mimetic desire relying on consciousness or not, or and how unconsciousness is brought into it. Would this theory almost be considered something like algorithmic, where it's almost like you have like positionings of people in places and they see each other and there's objects, and it's almost like Laplacian, like it's like if you have the original formation, you know how it's going to go in a certain way.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, it's also a danger too, because you can see how even like the turn to like information theory would lend itself to this kind of model of mimetic desire. So I'm almost wondering if the method of argumentation is almost, what is this classic adducto ad absurdum in some sense. Like he's almost like, or no, sorry, what's the logical fallacy in which your opponent is relying on a bunch of extra baggage that they don't need to make their argument? What is that called? I know it's kind of like Occam's razor, but there's something specific, I forget what it's called. But he's sort of saying that, right? He's saying like the double bind is desire itself in its mimetic structure. Freud gets lost in this mythical playground of superego and Oedipus and biology.
I was going to throw out there as well, Kate, I think you were the one that asked that question. There is a physicist from Duke. I think his name is Behan, B-E-G-A-N, Adrian Bejan, something like that. And he talks about the idea of what's called flow, which is a really interesting word. And he looks at it sort of like in a physical sense, like what people do. And so people do tend to like mimic what other people do. And that is mathematical. So there is an element of sort of physics at play with behavior, such that, for example, like if people walk through a park in a certain way, it eventually leaves a trail. He talks about all this in a sense of that. Maybe you know about him, Daniel. Do you know of this guy?
No, but it also reminds me of the whole work in neuroscience on what's called mirror neurons.
Yeah.
Very similar to that, right? Where the premise is that there's sort of preconscious cognitive processes which are structurally imitative prior to the assertion of consciousness. And all of that to me is like if Girard is saying that it's bad that Freud has a philosophical theory of the subject, that he's seeking to retain that, I'm almost wanting to take Freud's side immediately, because I worry that there's something too reductive here, you know?
Yeah.
In general, but go on, please. I'm actually not familiar with the person you cited.
Well, I think it's interesting because he sort of puts mathematics in the equation here as sort of predictability and mimesis, really. And it's really interesting because I think there is obviously the desire to sort of mesh the two and sort of predict behavior then. And I think that's sort of the start of what this gentleman was sort of working to do. And I think he, with the idea of flow, sort of that, you know, kind of like water, we tend to go certain directions. Now to me, the mirror neuron thing is interesting because they've done all these sort of different kinds of tests for people, and people tend to copy each other. So like, if you're at a dentist office, they did this thing, it's on the show called Brain Games. They did this thing where like, every 15 minutes, they would, you would hear a buzzer, and people would stand up. And then like people who were just like walking into this started doing the same thing. And it has absolutely no meaning. It's just, everybody's an actor. And sure enough, you walk in there blindly, every 15 minutes, you're standing up just like everybody else and sitting back down. So is that a mirror neuron? Probably. Somewhere there that's sort of pushing our desire.
I hear you, but I also think that in Moses and monotheism and in Fort Da and Freud's examples, right, what he's after is a classic philosophical exercise in trying to come up with an answer about a certain theory of human freedom through reason, right? Like if Freud's ideal society, or you know, whatever, is a kind of democratic dictatorship of reason or something, he calls it like that, right? It's interesting to me because all of that stuff of the child moving away, testing a movement away from the comfort of the maternal cathexis, all of that is so that the child will develop its own autonomy, its own independence. And so, yes, the mimetic condition is one in which the mimesis is violence and so on and so on. Freud actually gives us a lot on the other side of that, on the way out, on the cure, on the way out of this double bind. See my point? Whereas I feel like Girard is just saying religion, just like, you know, it's all about religion and it's all about, you know what I mean? It's like, so I think, I don't know. It's a really interesting debate though, for sure.
What I keep thinking of with these sections too is Bernard Stiegler in the one book, I think Neganthropocene or something like that. Interestingly enough, he quotes Levi Strauss from Triste Topics talking about how anthropology could become an entropology in the sense of entropy. Yeah. And the sense I get from Girard, as far as it's seen as either like algorithmic or reductive in whatever sense you want to say it, he's almost bringing about like Levi Strauss's entropology with this like sort of totalized theory of mimetic desire, and like that's it. And what seems like left out, and what at least what I read into what you're referring to would be like for like Stiegler, either like the negentropic or the anti-entropic qualities of like creative sublimation within Freud, and then even how religion is seen in Girard. The sense I get throughout all this is it's almost like a religion devoid of spirit. Like it's religion just as like a formal operator within a society. And I'm thinking then, I think also like in the Hegelian sense, I think that spirit would also be something like negentropic, like outside of just this like closed frame of an operator. Yeah.
Oh, completely. I get that feeling too, and it leaves me with a certain coldness, honestly. Yeah. It's why my intuition is opposed to Girard, I feel. Anyways, so here he's saying, sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just wondering, like thinking through all this, I also just kind of wanted to say that I'm still struggling a little bit to understand what Girard means by desire himself. And one of the reasons I think is specifically because of these issues that we've raised around biology. And my understanding was that part of when Freud is thinking of desire and desire for the mother and the cathexis directed toward the mother is specifically biological in the sense that the mother is the breast at first. So there's a certain kind of biological impetus to reach out toward the mother that is bound up then in some kind of, you know, greater sexual desire later on. And it just made me think basically how we like, and I'm asking because maybe I missed it, like how Girard exactly defines desire, what it is. And because it seems like basically you can desire an object and possess an object, and then that desire doesn't necessarily go anywhere else. Because that I would also ask then, like, if you possess the throne or the area of the father when the brothers war against each other, they're going against each other in some sense because they have this mimetic desire. But then when one wins, does their desire go anywhere else, or do they just desire to remain? Like these are things that are just unclear to me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's an interesting point too, because I feel like in Dupuy, the disciple of Girard, in his work, he's actually done some work that's been kind of interesting around sort of creating a theory of institution that would be no longer bound up within this double bind of mimetic desire. So what then is the theory of a group logic, which is no longer bound to mimetic rivalry, or no longer bound to acquisitive mimesis, right? And this is why, like, the whole theory there is actually one must privilege the inner group tensions and fault lines and before in order to address this, in order to weed it out. And then I guess what your question is like, post-structuralist philosophy, this is what's called subjectivization. And in psychoanalysis, it's what's called the end of analysis. And I think kind of one of your questions is, what happens to desire after the end of analysis, or after a resolution of mimetic desire in some sense, right? And I think that, as I understand it, what Girard is actually suggesting is that surrogate victims, as a logic, must be refined through rights. So rights must be a feature of social life in order to keep mimetic desire at bay. So I think the answer would be, there is no utopia. It's always this contagious violence. Desire as such holds a potential to unleash at any time. However, I feel like there's a certain set of technologies which are grounded in religion, which is why he says, you know, tragedy is when myth fails, when the efficacy of the rites fail, right? It's also, you know, conditions of stasis, right? So I think that the answer would be something like that. However, I'm not sure if he really adequately theorizes desire in a kind of non-negative sense, or in a kind of, because, you know, in psychoanalysis, the end of analysis has to do with the circumvention of the desire fantasy that was before, that was constructed on the field of the other. And ideally, the kind of tour of the fantasy that you undergo in psychoanalysis would lead the subject to a more autonomous orientation to their desire, right? A kind of rediscovery, right? Like a realization of different positioning of it for in relation. So you put desire to work in a certain sense. You don't end desire. And this is actually why I think Zizek's work on Buddhism has been super interesting, in the sense that, you know, there's a certain Christian theory of desire that's very much bound up with psychoanalysis, which is that there is no severing of the Gordian knot of desire, as you have in Buddhism, right? This is not all Buddhisms, but many, you know, like this, right? That it's possible to have this existence that has conquered desire, right? Whereas I think in the Christian psychoanalytic tradition, desire is something that is immersive, right? You sort of have to passage into the heart of the beast and tame it, to live with it, to be sort of metaphoric about it. You know what I mean? So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm kind of freestyling here, but I really feel like you're right, that I don't really see what Girard offers much about life after the conquering of mimetic desire. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's helpful to think through, I think. Yeah.
So let us return here. So yeah, obviously we see this, the various structures of Freudianism, castration.
Before you go on, can I ask something?
Hey, welcome. Yes, how are you?
Hi, Daniel. Sorry I was late. I didn't. Well, first I want to know. You said that you oppose Girard, you know, because of what Ben described, the kind of self-enclosed system, and I'm curious, what exactly is it that you oppose, you know? And then I also I don't think I understood Levi's question, because isn't that the very definition? The answer is within the very definition of Girard's desire, right? Which is that the conflict is everlasting. What I don't understand the question. So he brings on page 129, no? Right. Examples from the Greek theater.
You're actually asking Levi to restate his question.
Or
I think Levi, if I understand Levi right, he's looking to see what the subjective position is of a person within the context of this mimetic desire that's operating on a societal level. Where does that leave somebody once the, you know, are we simply depleted of desire once the violence happens? It's sort of this operation that sort of leads us to be sort of passive then.
Yeah.
And
no, he says it right here, page 47. Even death fails to tip the balance. The death of the brothers resolves nothing. It simply perpetuates the symmetry of the battle. Each had been his army's champion, and the two armies now resume the struggle, reestablish the symmetry. Tragedy now assumes the proper function as a verbal extension of combat. So isn't that in the within the basic understanding?
Well, I think, Chaim, what I was just trying to clarify was that, you know, in a, say, Lacanian psychoanalytic sense, when you desire is elusive, and the idea that you might fulfill desire with the acquisition of an object is false, right? It's essentially a fantasy. And so to say that one could assume the throne or whatever, or to have the mother or something else, means that even when you possess that thing, desire continues on, because in some sense the object is empty. And so I was just trying to figure out how desire fits into a Girardian model, in which it's never quite as clear to me how a particular subject desires beyond being in the midst of a kind of mimetic desire that produces a rivalry or a model, or a rival and a what is it? I guess the subject, the whatever. But that's all I was getting at. But I think getting the whole thing through that. So.
I think Girard's answer would be it sort of repeats, and it goes back into what he says, which is a buildup then of more mimetic desire. But I think too, like you say, Levi, Girard is leaving out the interpersonal aspect. The individual himself seems to be the important part here. And I don't think that Girard can quite account for the individual, because he is aiming to the social.
Yeah. I feel like we need to do like a math theme of Girard around the three you know, necessary figures that produce the obstacle model, right? So you have a highly structural production. Desire is a structural production of what he calls an obstacle model. And he even says here that the production of an obstacle can produce effects that are kind of like the unconscious, but they're not really the unconscious in some kind of true sense. They're only the effects of the introduction of mimetic desire onto a given field, which has produced the obstacle model. So, but you don't, that's why his colleague Dupuy can say we can actually think of an institution that is no longer bound up by a notion of the big other, right? We can actually create social relations that don't produce obstacle models, I think is here what he would say. Now, I think Levi is asking, as I understand it, is such a scenario as that, right? Like a kind of, I don't know, like a utopian Silicon Valley Girardian institution. Is that a desire-free assemblage? Or probably the answer is that no, they must, because he's big on this notion of the crisis of modernity is the absence of law, and therefore the crisis of modernity is a crisis around difference. And so when Freud develops Totem and Taboo, he says here, we can look at the quote. It's a nice quote, actually. Right here. the Oedipus complex appears most plausible in a society in which the father's authority has been greatly weakened, but not completely destroyed. That is, in Western society during, and then he says, it is not law in any conceivable form that is responsible for the tensions and alienation besetting modern man. Rather, it is the increasing lack of law. So you see Freud's offering a false solution, right? The perpetual denunciation of the law arises from a typically modern sense of resentment, a feedback of desire that purports to be directed against the law, but one that is actually aimed at the model obstacle, whose dominant position the subject stubbornly refuses to acknowledge. The more frenzied the mimetic process becomes, caught up in the confusion of constantly changing forms, the more unwilling men are to recognize that they have made an obstacle of the model and a model of the obstacle. Here we encounter a true unconscious, and one that can obviously assume many forms. So he's not taking the route of Michel Foucault, where he's sort of abandoning the notion of the unconscious or anything like that, right? So I think we should keep on moving here, because he actually develops some pretty striking insights as we move along. What is all of this stuff around psychoanalysis reaching a point, an advanced stage of indifferentiation or decoding, which involves the complete effacement of the paternal function? This is interesting, because here he's making a deep dive into Totem and Taboo, and he's noticing something really interesting, which is that Freud actually does not connect Oedipus to Totem and Taboo. They're two separate logics. They're two separate logics. And that's kind of really, to me, this was a big light bulb for me. It was like a really nice point. But we'll just round out chapter 7 here. The crime which was thrown onto his shoulders, presumptuousness and rebelliousness against a great authority, was precisely the crime for which the members of the chorus, the company of brothers, were responsible. Thus, the tragic hero, the father, became, though it might be against his will, the redeemer of the chorus. So therefore, the father is the surrogate victim. And that means that the logic also applies to Moses and monotheism, just as an aside. And he does briefly mention Moses and monotheism at the end of chapter 8. And then he says, the violence directed against the solitary hero takes place amidst the dissolution of the distinctions. So in other words, Totem and Taboo narrates the same kind of tragic structure as Oedipus does and other tragic plays in general. Okay. So I think chapter 8 is actually super fascinating. Let's go through some of this stuff. Religious totemism is connected with the operation in which violence, caught up in its own paroxysm, produces an inversion by means of an actual act of collective murder. Freud astutely surmised the necessity for this act, but because the mechanism of the surrogate victim eluded him, he failed to grasp its modus operandi. So, in other words, it's true. It is true that the foundation of culture is founded in a murder of a sacrificial nature, according to Girard. And it's interesting that Girard actually credits Freud with making this quote unquote discovery. And he actually praises Freud as a kind of novel or brave discovery. Anyways, he says, in many cultures, moreover, the man or animal or totemic monster assumes the guise of judge, mentor, and ancestor without relinquishing his role as victim slaughtered by his fellows. The first being cut down by a community, which, while mythic, is nonetheless a double reel of society. No matter how careful he may be to eliminate all traces of his presence, he's unable to extend his activities or repeat his past success without laying down a trial for his pursuers. So Freud did not pose the father horde murder as a dream. And this is actually an interesting point he makes. He says, why didn't Freud, or rather, and Lacan has an answer to this too, but rather, why did Freud say that the event was real? Like that it was a historical thing? Because he could have just as easily said that it lives on as a kind of fantasy. You see that? You see the difference there? It's an interesting point. it's a myth in some sense, but it's also has the status of a true historical empirical event. And I think we'd have to look at Robertson Stevens, the guy that he was leaning on to gauge that. I don't know if Levi, you could help us with that, but and here's his answer as to why he didn't put it in dreams, because he was trying to make a notion of the social dimensions of the myth of Totem and Taboo. So all of this stuff on surrogate victim, why is it that Freud didn't adequately discover the true structure of surrogate victim in Totem and Taboo? Let me see if we can move to that. Here, this is an important passage. What Freud fails to perceive is that his own thought is influenced by these same patterns, and then even his interpretation of tragedy forms part of the conflict and never succeeds in rising above it. Moreover, the fixed nature of his reading corresponds precisely to the concept of a single murder, of the true father, a true hero, which took place at a single time. I think what Girard is basically saying there is that Freud wants to end sacrifice in this momentous, traumatic event in some sense. And that this is actually not true, that in fact, modernity must actually inculcate. That's actually another mystery of Girard for me, at least, which is, I think, is he not suggesting that we need to like resurrect some form of rights that would satisfy sacrifice at this level? It seems to me that that's kind of, in some sense, what he's saying. So yeah, Sophocles, he basically says that Freud is radically different than Sophocles. And he says the sole object in dispute is the culture in crisis, of which each antagonist flatters himself that he's the true champion. Everyone is intent on diagnosing the illness in order to find a cure. But in fact, the illness is the other with his false diagnoses and poisonous prescriptions. All in all, the modern crisis, like all sacrificial crises, can be defined as the elimination of differences. The interplay of antagonisms actually does the eliminating without ever being recognized for what it truly is. The increasingly feeble, increasingly tragic intervention of difference. So some of this is confusing to me. I need you all to sort of jump in here. I mean, he's saying that as I read it, the mimetic structure of the model obstacle is in decline in some sense in the modern period on the one hand. And that, but what does that mean though? Like, in what way is it in decline? That we lack access to religious rights that would satisfy this? So therefore, we try to hide over desire as if it is some harmonious thing when it's actually not. If that's true, then what are the conditions that we suffer from as a result of that would be my question. I'm a little bit confused about that. I don't know if you all could help me on that. And the other thing I'm confused on is this notion of demystification, right? We need to do a side reading, by the way, to really understand in a deeper way Girard's critique of Freud. I don't know if you all knew this, but in his first book called Desire, Deceit, and the Novel, he says that Proust was the founder of mimetic desire, and that Freud, that Proust, went the farthest with understanding the mimetic structure of desire, basically. That's kind of the argument of that book. So a little bit of this stuff on 218, 217, I'm a little confused on this notion of mystifying demystification. I guess what it means in a kind of weird sense is Freud didn't see that the surrogate victim was the key, the structural kernel of his whole project, I think. And instead he went and further mystified things by creating these mythical theories, I think. Please jump in.
No, yeah, I agree. I agree.
And then here we have, okay, so maybe that is correct. Why is Oedipus suppressed in Totem and Taboo? And specifically, it's the version of Oedipus, the play, called Oedipus the King, the early one, where, like, you know, the whole business is not yet revealed. The murder hasn't taken place, but like all of the oracle is sort of set in motion, and Oedipus himself is searching for himself. So like it's the play at its most passive, where the fates are sealed in advance, right? And I will alert you to the point that Freud makes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is a very beautiful point, and Girard will mention it in a moment, where he says, what should interest us the most about the repetition compulsion is not so much neurotics, but as a condition of all humans, right? And then he gives several examples of this logic as a new theory of the fate of man. That's why the Oedipus complex becomes kind of superstructural, right? Yet, one would think, according to Girard, that Oedipus the King, because it is about this universal fate that you're plagued to this repetition and so on, and the triangle of the mother, father, and so on, right? Why is it not mentioned in Totem and Taboo? And here's the answer. As a primordial father figure, he has no father of his own, and thus can scarcely be said to have any complexes regarding his paternity. Neither repressed, sorry, let me just finish this one point. Neither repressed desire nor an actual act of patricide are satisfactory. The obstinate duality of Freud's theories, both here and throughout his work, suggests that a certain distortion has taken place. In avoiding the true problem, Freud turned away from what was potentially the most profitable line of inquiry. The paternal theme provides Freud's psychoanalytic adversaries and others with the very arguments they need to discredit his theory. It is the paternal theme that skews Freud's interpretation, preventing him from settling the problem of incest interdiction in a wholly satisfactory manner. And here he has a nice little passage, by the way, from Freud's Totem and Taboo. And I guess what he's trying to say here is that in some sense, this is what I think he's saying. You know how in psychoanalysis, you have a sense in which divinity is considered along the paternal metaphor. You see this in Freud, you see this in Lacan as well, right? I think what Girard is basically suggesting here is a kind of theory of transcendence, not connected to the paternal, is how I would theorize this in general sense. And that Freud is leaning on a crutch of the father as a kind of divine sovereign place, which is not necessary for him to do. Because what is that for Girard? It's just a surrogate victim. So I guess the outcome of that would be simply that Girard has something to dialogue or to teach us, especially I'm thinking here of the abolish the family authors, young authors, millennial age authors today, right? Who hate psychoanalysis. precisely for this paternal glorification, right? So anyways.
Can you back up a step with the divinity? What did you mean there, divinity and the paternal metaphor?
At the end of the murder of the father lives on as symbolic law. And the symbolic law creates an oath founded in guilt, which mediates the society, right? So this is the father of the symbolic, right? And the father of the symbolic becomes the father also of initiation. This is why I was actually wanting you to read Alain Badiou's beautiful essay, which analyzes Freud's theory of Totem and Taboo, where he says that the issue of Totem and Taboo is a theory of initiation. So like, why is it, for example, that we have a crisis of the paternal function or the stability of the father's authority? Badiou actually makes a beautiful point there, which is that no longer is the symbolic act of initiation mediated through compulsory warfare. It's a very nice point, but the idea of becoming a man used to actually be through the sacrifice involved with adhering to the symbolic order injunction to serve your country, something like that, right? You're kind of making a sacrifice, which is bound up with a commitment to a symbolic order, which is founded on the heroic sacrificial murder of the father. So it is in that sense that there is a sacred bond. And it is in that sense that the father has a sacredness and the social order has a sacredness about it in the Freudian mythos, okay? This is also why for Nietzsche, it says God is invented when we forget the empirical status of an ancestor over several generations. So that's why like a God is an issue of forgetting. So
that's definitely a religion without spirit, if anything is.
Yeah, but it kind of makes sense though. Like if you think about the notion of, it's really interesting. I love studying American history because before public relations and television, there was this, some mythical characters that became myths in their own time. Like they became a myth too early. Like Daniel Boone is a good example of that. And it drove him crazy. Like he was actually considered a kind of, I don't know, like a legend as he was alive. It was in the same sense that Derrida said that as he aged, people spoke about his thought as if he was dead, right? There's a certain way of speaking about the dead that is more concrete about their thought. You know what I mean? Their thought takes on a kind of coherence in some sense. So anyways, it's kind of like that. I don't know if that answers your question, but I would just theorize it like that, you know? That's the connection to the transcendence.
Usually when we talk about God, we go to the Seminar 20 and the sexual difference. That's a different discussion. I had another.
I wasn't saying that the father is God. Actually, the father that's the father of the symbolic. So the father of the imaginary, right, is the rivalrous conflict that ended the rivalry, right? That's the satisfaction of the murder. The father of the symbolic is the father who creates the code that keeps a sort of minimal harmony of the society in order. And that has a sacredness to it. God is actually of the real, right? So there's the kind of a sense in which there is a father of the real, but the father of the real, I think, in Lacanian theory, we usually speak of the father of the real as a kind of return of the repressed. right? So in a certain sense, the father of the real is that which is a threat of a return back to the imaginary conflict. So you need all three to kind of fend off a return to the imaginary. So I kind of like to theorize it like that. There's a beautiful journal called Umbra that is dedicated to the father of the real, like as a whole subject. There's a bunch of really nice articles on it. I can send it to you. But yeah, sexual difference is another way to theorize God as well. Anyways, I don't want to get too off of. So okay,
I wanted to.
Please.
Can I have a very important question? How do you? I can't read Freud anymore for himself. I've read too much Lacan, I guess, and others. And like earlier today, we were reading Comé's The Dash and talking how can we read Zizek without Hegel or Zizek for himself. How do you do it? And you're talking about, and it seems like even Girard himself can see that you have to read Freud metaphorically. That's essentially what he's saying. So how do you take them apart?
I'm going to actually turn to a little excerpt from Freud on the Fort Daw game in a moment to kind of conclude us. And we can read Freud directly from Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It depends on which text you're reading from Freud. I actually think it's actually much easier to read Freud than it is to read Lacan. I mean, Freud is like, it's a lot looser, you know? I mean, he's not nearly as expansive as Lacan. He's not nearly as complicated as Lacan. He's scared to speculate, you know, he's very allergic to philosophy, right? He confesses that he has a certain coyness. He has a lot of ideas, but he has a coyness about expressing them, I feel, you know? He's not nearly as bombastic. It's very interesting that Freud, his inner circle was so tight. He controlled everything on the inner circle, and he was very much not a democratic figure in the sense of like teaching the public and so on, like Lacan was. You know what I mean? He's much more closed off. And that's also why, like, I've been very interested in the rivalry that he had with Tausk. Victor Tausk was one of his close disciples who ended up committing suicide and writing his suicide note, basically blaming Freud. It's really intense stuff, right? But it's totally neglected by Freud. Like, he didn't even speak about this event, right? So let's go back to this thing of the father's actual existence in Totem and Taboo. Just read this passage. What up to then had been prevented by the father's actual existence was thenceforward prohibited by the sons, in accordance with the psychological procedure so familiar to us, the psychoanalysis, under the name of deferred obedience. They revoked their deed by forbidding the killing of the totem, the substitute for their father. And they renounced its fruits by resigning their claim to the women who had now been set free. They thus created, out of their filial sense of guilt, the two fundamental taboos of totemism, which for that very reason inevitably correspond to the two repressed wishes of the Oedipus complex. So there he's mentioning Oedipus complex, but Freud says nothing about what makes the reconciliation between the sons necessary or even possible, which I think is a very good point. You see the point there, which is we kind of just assumed that it was about their own desire for pleasure, but it wasn't just about that, because they created a highly like rational way to resolve it. Like, in other words, why didn't a new primal father emerge? Obviously, we know that primal fathers re-emerge in religions. This is a theme of religions. I mean, what else is Isis? That's what Isis is, right? That's the father of the real, by the way. The father of the real is the return to the imaginary. You see the point? That's like violent fundamentalism in religion, is the father of the real making his presence back onto the scene, right? Okay. He keeps on going with this, and yes, this is the really also important point. After the murder, both the brothers and the women are reduced to the anonymity of complete equality, but the father retains his separateness because he's dead. He's immune from the operation of this new social order of what he calls indifferentiation. He is the only one who does not relinquish his family role in the course of the proceedings. Freud manages to defilialize the sons, but he goes no further. The line of thought that breaks off here needs to be drawn out to its own conclusion. The father has to be depaternalized. There it is. You see that? That's why I think the father's made into this kind of break from the filial. And that's also maybe why Lacan will also talk about the name of the father. You see the point there? So there is a certain flexibility in the Oedipus myth, as well as in the resolution of Totem and Taboo, which is that the father is not necessarily the biological father, which is why for many people in psychoanalysis, the true father function does not usually come from the biological father. The true father function in an analytic case of our own time usually comes through like a friend. Like if you meet somebody in college that is really good at playing the guitar and they introduce you to that desire, they're actually in a formal sense playing the name of the father more so than your biological father is. Do you see the point? Because the thesis of the father in modern life, according to Lacan, is a father of yes, create a new desire. And so I think that's very much related to this notion of depaternalization. I don't know if that makes sense to you all. He says, in fact, the father explains nothing. If we hope to get to the root of the matter, we must put the father out of our minds and concentrate on the fact that the enormous impression made on the community by the collective murder is not due to the victim's identity, but to his role as a unifying agent. That's another key point. So that's actually why now it comes into focus. Do you see the point? If the father is defilialized, that means he's surrogate victim. He's kind of this kind of generic subject. You see the point? Does that make sense? If he's taken out of the whole equation, it's a perfect definition of Girard's point of surrogate victim. That's what a surrogate victim does. In the same sense we saw before, the surrogate victim enters from outside of a family feud. It's chosen from out, it's not like one of the people in the fight is chosen, it's somebody from outside is, right? Which is also why in some sense, Freud was also close to this by identifying the founder of Judaism in Moses as an outsider. So if Moses is an outsider, it's a perfect definition of surrogate victim too, to Girard's credit. Okay. And then he says, anything that prevents the act of murder from becoming merely an unalloyed operation of the surrogate victim also prevents it from taking place at its truly appropriate time. Only the surrogate victim is capable of bringing the inconclusive second theory to a conclusion. Yeah. In other words, it doesn't make sense to rely, or rather, it's like this. Freud was so close to realizing this logic of answering the question why the social order produced equality. And I think Girard is saying it produced equality because the father's taken out of the entire equation of being a member of the filial conflict itself. It's interesting if you think about dysfunctional families, like my own family, for example, it is the case actually that it's much better for the family if the father's not present. If the father is a monstrous father of the horde, let's say, it's much better that he's not there. You know what I mean? Okay. So then he gets into this whole thing of desire for most modern thinkers is anchored in object. In order to perceive the implications of an infinitely mobile mimesis, we must realize that the boundless potentiality of violence can only be contained by the surrogate victim. After all, we cannot postulate in man of a desire radically disruptive human relations without simultaneous. Okay, that makes sense. And then here he's saying this whole thing on humanism. We must acknowledge mankind's thorough dependence on religion. This, it is plain, Freud was not inclined to do. He was not alone in his subservience to an increasingly enfeebled humanist ideal. He had no intention of the intellectual revolution in which he was paving the way. I love this line. He says, animals of the same species never fight to the death, but the victor spares the life of the vanquished. Mankind, on the other hand, lacks this protection. So anyways, there it is. Some good stuff in there, some really good stuff. I mean, I think this whole notion of a enfeebled state of mankind, I'm not sure about that claim, in fact. And I'm not sure about his whole thesis of the crisis of difference. But let me stop the share and show you very quickly the what I also wanted to share with you very quickly on the Fort Da. Can you all see that? Okay. So, you know, this whole thing, were any of you in my Beyond the Pleasure Principle group? I think Cade, you might have been. I went into this in that group, but you know, Derrida in the postcard provides a wonderful critique of Freud's theory of the Fort Da in the sense of the way that he introduces it here. I've kind of quoted it on the side here, so we can just read it. So he's trying to come up with an argument around the universal status of the repetition compulsion. And he starts with the war neuroses. He then goes to dreams. He says this logic is present in dreams and war neuroses. And then he ends the chapter with the games of children. And he uses as an example a game that he was witness to at his daughter's home. And so it's a really weird, like, could you imagine, could you imagine somebody sharing a final argument, but bringing such a commonsensical example of like, yeah, this Thanksgiving, I witnessed my daughter do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to include this in my, you see what I mean? It's a very strange thing. Okay. Without the intention of making a comprehensive study of these phenomena, I availed myself of an opportunity which offered of elucidating the first game invented by himself of a boy of 18 months old. It was more than a casual observation, for I lived for some weeks under the same roof as the child and his parents. And Derrida makes the point here that Freud acts as if he's like an ethnologist, but it's like, actually, this is my grandson. And it was a considerable time before the meaning of his puzzling and continually repeated performance became clear to me. The child was in no respect forward in his intellectual development. At 18 months, he spoke only a few words, making besides sundry significant sounds which were understood by those about him. But he made himself understood by his parents and the maidservant, and he had a good reputation for behaving properly. He didn't disturb his parents at night. He scrupulously obeyed orders about not touching various objects and not going into certain rooms. And above all, he never cried when his mother went out and left him for hours together. Although the tie to his mother was very close, she had not only nourished him herself, but had cared for him and brought him up without any outside help. Occasionally, however, this well-behaved child evinced troublesome habit of flinging into the corner of the room or under the bed all the little things he could lay his hands on, so that to gather up his toys was often no light task. He accompanied this by an expression of interest and gratification, emitting a loud, long drawn out ooh, which in the judgment of the mother, one that coincided with my own, was not an interjection, but meant as, go away. I saw at last this was a game, and that the child used all his toys only to play being gone, fourth sign, with them. One day I made an observation that confirmed my view. The child had a wooden reel with a piece of string, like that. It never occurred to him, for example, to drag this after him on the floor and so play horse and cart with it, but he kept throwing it with considerable skill, held by the string over the side of his little draped cot, so that the reel disappeared into it. Then he said his significant ooh, and drew the reel by the string out of the cot again, greeting its reappearance with a joyful da, there. So away, there, away, there. This was therefore the complete game, disappearance and return. The first act being the only one generally observed by the onlookers and the one untiringly repeated by the child as a game for its own sake, although the greater pleasure unquestionably attached to the second act. The analysis of a single case of this kind yields no sure conclusion. On impartial consideration, one gains the impression that it is from another motive that the child has turned the experience into a game. He was in the first place passive, was overtaken by the experience, but he now brings himself in as playing an active part by repeating the experience as a game in spite of its unpleasing nature. This ever might be ascribed to the impulse to obtain the mastery of a situation, the power instinct, which remains independent of any question of whether the recollection was a pleasant one or not. But another interpretation may be attempted. The flinging away of the object so that it is gone might be the gratification of an impulse of revenge, suppressed in real life, but directed against the mother for going away, and would then have the defiant meaning, yes, you can go, I don't want you, I'm sending you away myself. The same child a year later than my observations used to throw on the floor a toy which displeased him and say, go to the war. He had been told that his absent father was at the war, okay? So in the case discussed here, however, the child might have repeated a disagreeable impression in play only because with the repetition was bound up a pleasure, a gain in pleasure of a different but more direct kind. So, so we have several themes at play here, which is what is the child gaining from the game? On the one hand, it's a test. From an enlightenment standpoint, it's a test in the wherewithal of the constitution and autonomy of the independence of the child. But according to Freud's new theory of death drive and beyond the pleasure principle, there's something else at play. The something else is a repetition, which is producing a different type of pleasure, which is a kind of pleasure gained through a type of sadism. Now let's see what Girard has to say about Freud's Fort Da. I've excerpted this for you all from Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Here he says, Freud understands, or so it seems, that the Fort Da amounts only to the imitative reprise of a game initiated by adults. If the mother can easily tell that the ooh of the child signifies fort, it is because she has acted as a model to the child. In fact, it was she who taught the child this game. Freud goes on to say that it makes no essential difference for the affective value of the game, where it is invented in all its details by the child or whether he takes it up as a result of a suggestion from somewhere else. Then he goes on to say, quoting Freud, it is, of course, a matter of indifference from the point of view of judging the effective nature of the game, whether the child invented it himself. Okay, obviously such a question cannot be unimportant. The issue is whether the process by which symbolism arises is the result of imitation. No great ingenuity is required to see that imitation, together with substitution, does play a crucial role in all the stages of ritualistic exercise. So he's calling this a ritualistic exercise, yeah? The substitution is not primary, but secondary.
Mm.
For it is in itself no more than the imitation of a substitution that is inherent in all victimage processes. See, this is why I chose this example, because there's nothing more simple than this to understand Girard. The substitution is not primary, but secondary, for it is in itself no more than the imitation of a substitution. Our conclusion is that even if Freud does not actually uncover the scapegoat mechanism, he comes very close to it in this text when he states that there is a reciprocal affinity between revenge and the constructive process of substitution. So, okay, so then the whole speculation that Freud had just a moment ago about revenge, Girard is affirming, and in fact, this is the case. And then he says, Freud understands so well the importance of the imitation in the entire process that he feels he must account for the absence of any explicit thoughts on the subject. There is no need, he suggests, to assume that a special imitative instinct is there. He says, quote, nevertheless, it emerges from this discussion that there is no need to assume the existence of a special imitative instinct. Here, particular emphasis is placed on the word besonderen, special, and Freud would not dream of denying imitation any role. If Freud had dwelt on the matter a bit longer, he might have realized that pure invention is not feasible. Either the child is imitating a form of behavior which has already acquired symbolic form, or the spirit of violence and revenge prompts the symbolization by suggesting ways of combating the state of powerlessness with no real revenge. So that's Girard's reading of Fort Da. Now, what is Lacan's reading of the Fort Da? This is Lacan's reading here. I want to show you how different this is. Freud, in a flash of genius, presented to us so that we might see in them that the moment at which desire is humanized is also that at which the child is born into language. So there's a lot going on in the Fort Da game for Lacan. Okay, just be prepared here. A lot. The child's being introduced to language. So the whole business of autonomy, okay, of the test, of release, and of the beyond of that, is a slow introduction into a logic of signifier relations for the child. Okay. We can now see that the subject here does not simply master his deprivation by assuming it. He raises his desire to a second power. For his action destroys the object that it causes to appear and disappear by bringing about its absence and presence in advance. It's a classic Lacanian paradoxical point. Very beautiful point on negation, actually. His action thus negativizes the force field of desire in order to become its own object to itself. What is the force field of desire here? It's this cathexis maternal object, right? It's das Ding. Yep. His action thus, and this object, being immediately embodied in the symbolic pair of two elementary exclamations, announces the subject's diachronic integration of the dichotomy of phonemes, whose synchronic structure the existing language offers up for him to assimilate. The child thus begins to become engaged in the system of concrete discourse of those around him by reproducing more or less approximately in his fort and da the terms he receives from them. Fort and da, by the way, fort da is like S1, S2. Remember my presentation from last time of S1 and S2? The split in them is where the subject resides, by the way. So he's saying that the fort da is the child's elementary introduction into primal repression, according to Lacan. Okay, it's heavy duty stuff. Who would have thought that this innocent example would produce all of this, right? Fort da, it is already when quite alone that the desire of the human child becomes the desire of another, of an alter ego who dominates him and whose object of desire is henceforth his own affliction. Do you see how important that is? Do you see how important that is? There's a splitting of desire from the maternal in the child's experimental movement away from it. This is incredibly central. Should the child now address an imaginary or a real partner, he will see that this partner too obeys the negativity of his discourse. And since his call has the effect of making the partner slip away, he will seek to bring about the reversal that brings the partner back to his desire through a banishing summons. Thus, the symbol first manifests itself as the killing of the thing, and this death results in the endless perpetuation of the subject's desire. Heavy duty. Heavy duty. So why is it then humanized? It's because the reprieve of the beyond, of the ooh, is an overture to sort of fling the child out of the thingliness of the maternal. So that's number one. And that is a sort of fundamental opening of a type of erasure of symbolization of the thing from which they are leaving, right? So it's kind of like the precondition of the child entering into the field of speech comes at the attempt to symbolize the status of the maternal desire, okay? That's this whole business up above about negation and all of that. The object the child makes appear and disappear is less important for Lacan than the phonemic distinction, which is, quote, the point of insemination for a symbolic order that pre-exists the infantile subject, and in accordance with which he has to structure himself. So we're not done yet, if you all have time, if that's okay. There's another place where Lacan discusses this in the Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. Can you all see this okay?
Yes.
Here's what he says. The real, this is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful way to understand Lacan's theory of the objet A, okay? Because this object here, this thing, the real, is the objet A, okay? The real is not the mother reduced to a little ball by some magical game worthy of the Hivaros. It is a small part of the subject that detaches itself from him while still remaining his, still retained. This is the place to say, in imitation of Aristotle, that man thinks with his object. It is with his object that the child leaps the frontiers of his domain, transformed into a well, and begins the incantation. If it is true that the signifier is the first mark of the subject, how can we fail to recognize here, from the very fact that this game is accompanied by one of the first oppositions to appear, that it is in the object to which the opposition is applied in act, the real, that we must designate the subject. To this object, we will later give the name it bears in the Lacanian algebra, the small a. The activity as a whole symbolizes repetition, but not at all that of some need that might demand the return of the mother. You see, that's the point too, is that the repetition that's at play here is not merely a rote imitation procedure. If desire is fundamentally linked to the introduction of the symbolic order, that's a very different procedure. You see the difference, because the difference is that the subject is actually thrown into the matrices of a symbolic order that is no longer, that is now based on the distinction between metonymy and metaphor, right? It's sort of a complex introduction, right? So what the Fort Daw game demonstrates is the preconditions of a subject's entry into that order. Okay, so we can talk about the structure of that order, but it's really, and that's the name of that is primal repression. Okay. Okay, it is the repetition of the mother's departure as cause of a spalting in the subject. This is super important as well. Overcome by the alternating game fort da. What is a spalting? A spalting is a cut, a scission. It's like the, you can almost think of it like the umbilical cord, you know, when it's cut, right? It's kind of like that. Like the subject is the effect of the split of the fort da, of the beyond and of the here. The subject's in between that, right? Is one way to think about it, okay? Overcome by the alternating game fort da, which is a here or there, and whose aim in its alternation is simply that of being the fort of a da, the da of a fort. It is aimed at what essentially is not there, qua represented. For it is the game itself that is the representation of the Vorstellung. So it's a double form of representation. What will become of the Vorstellung when, once again, the representation of the mother in her outline made up of the brushstrokes and gouges of desire will be lacking? So you see, it's also two orders of representation, right? It's the primal representation of the mother thing and this new order of desire, okay? That's what he means about these two, Vorstellung and Repräsentanz. And then if development is entirely animated by accident, by the obstacle of the Tuk. Oh yeah, sorry, no, this is separate. This whole, you can disregard this area. This is a separate issue. So yeah, so just to conclude here, for Lacan, a lot is at stake with Fort Da. And I've just sort of given you the outline of it. We can read, you should read more about it. First, it is to be understood as one signifier. Because the one signifier of the Fort Da shows that in the space in between, the subject resides. So that's one point. Second, the child is making an effigy. He says the child makes an effigy of the situation by naming it Fort or Da. And it's really interesting that he uses the term effigy, because effigy is a sacrificial act, which connects us to Girard in a weird way, right? So the notion is that the thing, the status of representation from the standpoint of maternal desire, its condition of entry into signifiers, into the world of language, comes at the cost of an effigy. It's like a primal sacrifice in some sense. And then the process of substitution that takes place in the process of naming, not only in how the name the situation replaces the situation, but also how imaginary links are made between the signifier and the signified through the object A. So there it is. The Fort Da. Pretty crazy, huh?
Where is that paper? That's a paper by Lacan, yeah? The last thing?
This one is an excerpt. No, this one is an excerpt from the Écrit at Mark 319. Okay, I think it comes in the lecture Dialectic of Desire, the Subversion Dialectic, that one. And this one on Touquet and Automaton in Four Fundamental Concepts under repetition. So under the concept of repetition in Four Fundamentals, he talks about Fort Da, which is exactly what Freud does here when he talks about the three examples of repetition: dreams, children's games, right? And why Fort Da is so interesting is because it demonstrates in simple, common, accessible way the kind of universal status of the psychoanalytic theory of drive repetition, basically, right? So I don't know what you all think about Girard's critique here, but yeah, I think that helps us a little bit.
Did you say anything about, by the way, thank you for all this. You did a lot of preparation. Did you say anything about Girard on how you understand Girard's commenting here on Lacan?
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't find it too convincing. I mean, I think what he's trying to say is that, you know, look, the Fort-Da game, it contains an imitative desire, which the child learned from the mother. He's saying that, number one. Number two, he's saying that the game is, what does he say? Let's go back to it. He says right here, yes, this whole business of substitution. So he reduces the logic of the game to a logic of substitution, and that it's a clean theory. What he's offering, a way of, but it doesn't leave me convinced of Girard's. I mean, what Freud and Lacan are developing with it is simply a lot more rich. Girard's critique strikes me as a little boring and a little, I don't know, like not that interesting. What do you guys think?
It seems like for Girard, there's really only like a singular order of being, like of this mimetic desire. So like that sort of differentiation between like the imaginary with the thing and then the symbolic object that Lacan seems to be bringing about that passage with the Fort-Da. It seems like for Girard, you just have this almost mechanistic order of mimetic desire, and it's not even sensible to talk about anything like above or below that.
Yes.
Yeah, and like I feel like also by sort of stripping everything of like enjoyment, it like his account strips the game of the enjoyment that the child gets in playing it.
Right.
And that sort of, yeah, it makes it much less poor in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's actually not true that the novelty of this game can be reduced to substitution and imitation of what the mother taught, because so if that's the introduction to the symbolic, if the symbolic is just if the meaning of this game for Girard is this is the first enactment for this child of a right, okay, that doesn't actually help us understand why the child repetitively does it over and over and over again. Yeah? Well, what precisely is the child mastering? It's slightly irrational, right? Right? Girard doesn't really have anything to say about that. And I think that's the weakest point as well. That's what I would say, Kayam, is that's the weakest point. There's clearly a repetitive thing, and I don't know. Why is that? I think Lacan and Freud are giving us a much better way to understand that. So anyways, were you all familiar with this Fort-Da thing before tonight?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, right? I think it's a really nice way to think about psychoanalysis. So if anybody ever asks you for like a practical example, you should use this one, you know?
Yeah, I think it does a good job too of sort of explaining the subject who is tethered between these two extremes. Yeah, and needs both of these sort of, and then becomes sort of paradoxically the subject. Again, I think it's
and not to mention that the Spaltung, the sacrifice of making the effigy of the maternal object, as another order of representation and then introduce it to a new one, requires, and I love how he says Aristotle was correct. He's like, Aristotle knew this, requires that we have an aid object to navigate us with this. I love this. If anybody ever wants to ask you, what the hell is the object small a? Remember the Fort Da. That's your best account of it, I believe.
Yeah, so say that again about Aristotle, you say, is the...
Oh yeah, let me just read the thing one more time. It's a really nice quote. He says right here, this real is not the mother reduced to a little ball by some magical game. It is a small part of the subject that detaches itself from him while still remaining his, still retained. So in other words, when the child's throwing the ball, part of the phenomenology of the ball for the child is kind of both himself and his attachment to his mother, right? This is the place to say, in imitation of Aristotle, that man thinks with his object. It is with his object that the child leaps the frontiers of his domain, transformed into a well, and begins the incantation. If it is true that the signifier is the first mark of the subject, how can we fail to recognize here, from the very fact that this game is accompanied by one of the first oppositions to appear, that it is in the object to which the opposition is applied in act, the real. And I love it's that the real, but also the real, that we must designate the subject. To this object, we will later give the name it bears, small a.
So to me, that really says that by making things into things, it gives us sort of the ability to be a subject and to be able to organize ourselves in some ways by having this object for ourselves, maybe even a conceptualization, so to speak.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it means that it means a lot. I mean, it means if the introduction of the child into the symbolic is a spalton, this kind of scission, right? That's a at the primordial level, it's deep castration. It's a deep void.
Violent.
Void experience, right? A kind of, so it's almost like the tool to lift you out of the hole, as the objet. It's kind of like a, something like that, right? It's like a magical power of something that's yours, an extension of you. It's like the primordial cyborg tendency of man or something. So yeah, I'm in love with this example. I think it's so, probably because I have little children, I like it, but it also makes you wonder about teddy bears, like why children have latch on to, objects like that,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Winnicott has some stuff on that with like transitional objects too.
Yeah. And I think actually the transitional object for Winnicott is very much, like Fort Da is very much theorized in this context, because I know for Winnicott, games is a huge mode of therapy, right? So anyways, that's something to look into as well.
Does anyone have any last thoughts on it's not lost on me either, the real, the word for real is real.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's by, there's more there.
Yeah, nice. I love that.
Well, I was going to say one other thing, maybe it'd be good to bring up here just to sort of complicate things again. But if Girard is sort of pointing to religion as the sort of mechanism to solve some of the violent problems, and to me, what he's sort of saying then is by having law, we have order then. By having religion and the structure, we have differentiation, and that can sort of lead us away from violence. But I think there's an element here that Lacan and Freud are pointing to individually, that it's not just this outside force. And here's why. They did a study of a sort of, and I'm trying to recall it exactly, but they did a study, and I might have listed it in the Slack, where they had people sort of name things, and then they did a measurement later to sort of say, once people name things, what happens? And essentially by naming things, people sort of develop biases through the naming system that helps them organize things. And it does so in a way that is biased. So it creates these shortcuts that I think really eventually sort of lead to bigger problems. So because we take these shortcuts with what we call X, Y, and Z, we play favorites. And by playing favorites, all this mimetic sort of stuff or all these sort of violent actions are much more likely then, actually, not less likely. So I think Girard, I think, does a good job. And that's why I think he should have really made friends with Freud instead of sort of treating him as a rival, is to incorporate all those things and add the mimetic desire as sort of this historical piece, which I think does make sense on at least that level historically. But once you start teasing it out, I think you run into all sorts of more problems.
Right. So yeah, I agree with you. I agree. I mean, Girard's, I think for next time we should really read his essay on anti-Oedipus. That will really help us understand the complicated relationship that he has to psychoanalysis. I don't know if everyone's read Anti-Oedipus or not, but even if you haven't, I think it's still a useful read.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think you're right. But also keep in mind, he does not lambast Freud too much, right? I mean, he says many, many praiseworthy things about the psychoanalytic method and so on. So,
well, he plays Fort Da with Freud. He throws Freud away and then he brings him back and says, but here, look what we got.
Yeah. Because what is it? Derrida invokes his notion of difference in the Fort Da split, right? So you should read Derrida's reading.
I'm not familiar with that.
You should look at it. He provides a super, because what he says there is that because the example is from Freud's own family, the entire edifice of the repetition compulsion that Freud is arguing is just an extension of a kind of grand self-analysis.
Sure.
Because Freud's daughter will die in between the publication of the book and the mention of that. So it's totally suppressed, that fact.
Sure.
Very interesting thing. But Derrida's like that, though. He's kind of a writer who will say about one thinker that they open up all of these vistas and you can do anything with their concepts. Whereas with other thinkers like Freud, he's so much more like circumspect. Like he actually hates Freud. Like if you ever read this essay he wrote called Psychoanalysis, he really agrees with Deleuze and Guattari that psychoanalysis became kind of like a psychic imperialism, especially of like the developing world. Anyways,
seems to be a common sentiment.
Like a kind of imperialism of the old European psyche or something like that.
Yeah, paternal. Yeah,
right.
For sure. Yeah.
Anyways,
you see all the Lacanians on the board of the IMF, so it makes some sense.
Are they really?
I'm not aware of any, no.
Okay. I was like, wait, what? God, that would be bad. All right. So in the event you have time, you should join us tomorrow because Samo Tomczyk's going to give his presentation, which I've personally been looking forward to for quite a while. if you guys are free.